I I guess firstly just to say thank you so much, Minha, for the film. Uh, it was extraordinary to see it on the big screen and with a sound system. I'd seen it before, but like I was discovering all kinds of new dimensions about it. There's so much to talk about in this film, and I feel quite confident that there are also questions in this audience that we should extract before you're allowed to leave. But maybe to start with, Celia mentioned in the introduction that this footage is from 93, 94. I mean, it's in the film as well. I wonder if you could just start by talking about, there's a kind of line in the film that comes back about, why is China calling me now? Could you just talk about this relationship between the then and now? Like, what is it, what was that, the project of gathering that footage of this architecture and these communities, and what is it almost 30 years later that kind of compelled you to return to it?
So I guess it started out as a collective research because it involved the research of Jean-Paul Bourdier, who is the architect, a visual artist, and also photographer. And he was very interested in vernacular architecture, not monumental architecture, but actually the architecture done by people for the people. And then you have Hui Zhu, who is an architecture student at the time. He's now a professor. But he was from Beijing, and he has never been out from Beijing yet. So when he heard that we were going to the countryside to look at architecture, he wanted to come with us. And then myself, who is interested, among other things, in doing research with time-based arts, so mainly with film and video. So it was a kind of collective research because each one of us has like a different entry into the subject, into architecture. For me, for example, focusing on architecture and focusing on space, the question of lighting, the question of color, the question of structuring space are all questions that relate to cinema. So, in other words, doing research on architecture is also doing research on cinema. And so that was how it started as a project. But usually, unless I have a source of funding immediately, or someone commissioned the film, I don't jump on it to work right away. I usually let the material mature. And then only, when I feel, the call to complete it, I would complete it. So in this case, China was calling me then, in 1993-94, and China is calling me now, and why? And the question is also not only the funding aspect, because indeed it was the curator, Ute Meta-Bauer, who approached me and said that I know that you have several projects and I'm really interested in the China one. So she started mentioning the possibility of funding. But for me, it was a time that is ripe enough because the discussion around China has become very competitive. China was considered to be an economical rival, and also a lot of hostility because there is a tendency in the West, and especially in the US, to put the blame on others instead of taking care of the situation in the US, which was at the time really dramatic. And instead of taking care of that situation, they start spreading negativity around the fact that China was responsible for it, and so on and so forth. So not only Chinese people, but all the Asian Americans were involved because they don't know who is Chinese and who is not Chinese. So we are all put in the same bag. And of course, you know, with that kind of hostility, I find myself in situation where people around were like saying a lot of negative things on the subject, and I would say, what about China? So this is neither positive nor negative. It's just amazing that why, you know, people are suddenly pitching on China in certain ways, you know. So that is like motivating, as you can see the title of the film. But also the title come from an old preoccupation of mine, which is when you go to another place, and even when you go to your own, like when I go back to Vietnam, my own native culture, the immediate question is, how do you show and tell? And that's why you see at the beginning of the film, which, when, where, how, and what about? Because there is a tendency to simply point at a reality as if that reality is outside of you, over there. So China is only over there. That's why we can speak about it in such a hostile way. But if China is also in here, then what you are pointing at negatively is that stranger within yourself. You know, so that stranger at home that you have to deal with. And this is why also in the film I was mentioning the China within. What about the China within? We are related to China in every way, every aspect of life. You go out, you go to a Chinese restaurant, you buy something from China, you have a t-shirt, whatever you purchase from China, you have a relation with China. And so this China that we carry with us everywhere is something that we tend to take for granted. So why would we go with the China that is defined by the media or defined by a form of rivalry or political, economical situation, for example? So these are the questions, you know, that arise with China. Why is China calling me then, and why is China calling me now? And now is also related to the pandemic. So that's why you hear, in the midst of this dramatic loss, you have a song of love. Or in the midst of a tragic situation, you have an artistic endeavor.
Thank you, and I'd love to come back actually to some of these kind of political subtexts, which are so important. But just because you mentioned the music, you know, I think for everyone here, it's just such an incredible part of the experience, especially here, that the music is so beautiful, and it's so clearly important, kind of conceptually, to the film. And there's a moment of saying like reality is musical, but maybe you could talk a bit about that, but also start just by saying perhaps a little bit about these folk songs that kind of come back again and again. Like, where were they from, and how did you come to select them, and what, just the importance of them for you in the film.
Yes, we come back to the question also, why is China calling me now? And I gave the reason of funding, but actually it's not enough to motivate one to make a film, right? Even though funding can be very important, but you have to be motivated. And what motivated me was a session of acupuncture, as you could hear in the film. I was lying there waiting for a session of acupuncture, and I was like really feeling pains everywhere. And suddenly I hear a voice, you know, of someone singing. And the voice was so beautiful. It was like being in spring water suddenly, and then not feeling any of the pain anymore. So when I came out of the session, I asked the acupuncturist, I said, who is that, and why is she singing in the midst of you know, everyone lying there, you know, sick and in pain and so on. And so the acupuncturist said, well, she didn't have any money, so I told her, if you can't pay, you don't have money, then just sing. And for me, it was really the power, the healing power of music that was felt so strongly that I returned to the film. And one of the first things that I wanted in putting the film together are the folk songs. And then second was to look for someone who can play, music in a way that is, time for me is never linear. Time is really, as said in the film, what if time is a river, and what if the ancient is not past and the modern is neither present nor futuristic? And that's because every single image that you see here are memory image. It's now time. You experience it in now time. And now time is neither past, present, or future, but now time bears all of them, past, present, and future. So with that in mind, the question of time, whenever I say 1993, 94, it's not really 93, 94. We know very well that in political situation, and especially in situations that are sensitive, we don't use language directly. So you can see the body of films made from mainland China on the 1930s, especially all the film made in Shanghai. Why? Are people focusing on that period? Of course, there are many reasons. One of the reasons is that the actors are glamorously clad. So the men are all in Western outfit, and women are so glamorously clad during that period that it, in a way, it hides the fact that the 1930s is not really 1930s. So it's another way of speaking about dominations, oppression, and so on. But of course, it is what passes the censorship, because it was during that period. So for me, 1993, 94, I never put a date on the material. I think it's very naive. But I do it paradoxically in order to put a limit, at the same time to put a limit on what you see, all these phantom images, but also to refer to certain situations and issues that are very, very current, including the notion of harmony that covers from the time of the ancient to today. Did I answer?
Beautifully. Maybe you could actually develop that thought a bit further, because obviously the musical metaphor does connect to this political and ethical idea of harmony, and at a certain point in the film, harmony is contrasted to stability as a kind of more contemporary, authoritarian, governmental idea. Mm-hmm. Could you just talk a bit more about that, about this whole kind of more metaphysical musical metaphor of the musicality of reality and the idea of harmony as a kind of ethical or political ideal also?
Mm-hmm. Well, we can say on the one hand, the notion of harmony comes first and foremost from music. And it was during Confucius' time that this notion is really put forward, harmony. And he used it almost in an ethical way, to instruct about behaviors and morality and so on. So you can hear the different voices in the film. There is one voice, the one of Xiao Lu Guo, who said she can't believe, this rotten Confucius is like this rotten man who is venerated from centuries to centuries, whereas there are plenty of things against women that he had put forward, for example. That was in her case, right? And then on the other hand, you also have my voice that says that he was raised single-handedly by his mother, who is a commoner. And so with that in mind, we know that the notion of harmony as put forward by Confucius is at the same time, it has to do with music certainly, because as you could hear, listening to music is, listening to the wind is listening to music. So music and cosmology really goes together. And architecture, first and foremost, before the form and the material, you have the geomancer, the one who reads the harmony between wind and water. So that is one of the most important part in ancient time. You don't just build your house anywhere. You build it in key places, for example. And you always resort to the geomancer who read the land, the rhythm of the land, and the harmony of wind and water. And hence you can see immediately that music and architecture are totally linked. And with that you have architecture linked to the cosmic, and music also linked to the cosmic. Architecture as the way, for example, that space structure daily life. And so with that, for me, not only in the film, the focus on harmony puts music on the forefront, but also I have always worked with music. That's the part that I enjoy the most, actually, in editing a film, is really working on music. And the same thing with writing. I think that my writing can only hold, not because of an idea. The same thing with film, right? You put forth an idea, or you think you may edit according to an idea, but it doesn't work at all. As long as you do not look at what you have or listen to what you have. So in that sense, editing or working with music is really like in writing. You write with an ear, not just with ideas. So when you write with an ear, you can have brilliant idea, but it wouldn't work in that sentence because musically it doesn't work. So you have to wait until that word finds its place in the sentence and then write. So it's the same way that I work with film. So you have film, architecture, and music totally linked.
Can we bring in another art form, which is painting? Because it was interesting at the beginning. You talked about your method being to try to undo this hierarchy between center and margin, which is very interesting. And in the film, there's these moments of these close-ups of these, I think Song Dynasty paintings, and this account of is it Guoxi, the three perspectives?
Yes, it was Guoxi. Yes.
And I was really curious, for example, if obviously the film has a very distinctive way of weaving together, for example, voices without introducing them. Sometimes they interrupt each other. There's a kind of collaging of perspectives, and I just wondered if there was if you felt an identification with, for example, this form of painting in which contains multiple contradictory perspectives. If the painting in a way was had a relationship to your editing process, for example.
Mm-hmm. Oh, certainly. And in my film, I always view the making of film as something that I call the twofold commitment. So it's at least two, in the sense that you focus on the subject, but what you see in an image is how you see it. It's a manifestation of how you see it. And we tend to forget that. So we take for granted that what we see is there. But actually what you see is how you see the image. That's why we can all look at the same image and still speak around it or speak toward it in a way that is totally different. One person sitting next to the other can see the same image and speak in a different way, in relation to this image. So I think this notion of slightly displacing what you see, for example. I think I'm off track. Can you bring it back?
Well, I don't think so. I think this. It sounds in a way like you're you're relating it a bit to the idea of the speaking nearby, which I think which Shelley introduced, and there's something in a way about the kind of editing process which doesn't seem to want to speak for the people in the film, but at the same time they're not also. It's unusual, for example, like in your previous work, you've worked very much with the interview form, for example, and it's been very present. And here it's very noticeable that there are none of the people depicted speak, or we hear them, but it's not translated.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a bit about that? Maybe
Maybe then I would come back to, since you raised about the voices earlier, and that you said that sometimes there's even an interruption. You have a space of multi-vocality, many voices. Not only you have the four voice, that did the narration. So you have the voice of Xiao Luguo, who is a novelist, a memoirist, and a filmmaker. And she actually, the book that she wrote was autobiographical. So that's why you hear her talking about her father. Oh, I remember now. The question of the painting. Thank you. I chose Shi Tao instead of illustrating what she said, which is she's talking about her father and the painting that her father did. So instead of going to her father's painting, illustrating what she said, and this links us up with the speaking nearby, is that rather than doing that, I do what I consistently do throughout the film, which is not to interview someone directly on camera, not to simply translate what is being said on camera, but rather selecting someone who has had a very strong background among peasantry, like Xiao Luguo, or among villagers, like the poet, Xiao Yueshan. And the same thing with the painting. Rather than illustrating what she was saying about her father, I was choosing the painter that I love most, who is a painter of the 17th and 18th century, Shi Tao. He's an extremely well-known painter because he was constantly working with blank space. So the blank space in a painting is just as eloquent as whatever is being drawn on the page. And he really worked with that, what we call empty space or blank space. And at the end of the film, I was talking about the median void, something that comes in between sky and earth, for example, the median void. And these are really the space of all kind of possibilities. And to be able to work with that blank space is also what I'm trying to do with film. You don't simply rely on the visible, but you always build with the visible the invisible. Put the invisible into action when you are showing something that is visible. It seems like very abstract, but actually it's a very concrete process. So with this, you don't speak about, you don't speak on behalf of someone, you don't speak for the people, but you can speak with, you can speak to. Like when I said, I speak with my hand, you listen with your eyes and so on. You are speaking to. You can speak with, or the mode that I like best is to speak nearby. But in order to speak nearby, you have to go very intimate. It's not just, nearby means there's a distance between the two. No, the gap between the two is deliberately there so that the other can come in and feel it in whichever way they want. But at the same time, you have to come so close. You are dealing with something very intimate. So this is the notion of speaking nearby. Yes.
Thank you. And I mean, I'd like to kind of open it up quite soon, but I have a couple more questions. I mean, one relates a little bit to this idea of being in between, and I think one of the things that really struck me watching the film, in terms of the kind of politics, is you're talking about the kind of great uprooting that's happened, this kind of forced urbanization in China, and it was interesting in a way that it feels like, for example, particularly in America, I think, for example, the discussion of the rural-urban divide tends to suggest that it tends to take on these very cliched forms of the kind of rootless cosmopolitans versus the conservative rural heartlands. Whereas in a way, there seems to be an act of recovery in the film where you're pointing. It was interesting, for example, in documentary also, there seemed to be in the documentary exhibition, there was several projects engaging with the discourse of the peasantry and the idea of the importance of peasant tradition as being, most revolutions in the 20th century having come from being driven by peasant communities rather than urban ones. So I wonder, that's a kind of huge question, but it's obviously like a very central part of the film, and the film is very careful to not be nostalgic, but also to seem to want to preserve something that is, as the film says, disappearing. Could you just speak a little bit to that question?
We come back to the notion of time. Since I don't live time as something that is linear, but rather as a spiral. It's the spiral, time spiraling in and spiraling out is really a form of growth, so that you always come back, but you never come back to the same. So this is tradition, and Xiaolu Guo had a different way to bring that out when she said that tradition is now like under her skin, and it is taking charge of everything. And that's how she returned to the China of her childhood, that she's not rejecting it anymore. Because when she was in China, she was very much for the new. And as she said in 1994, the call is not for all workers unite, but rather all punk youth could galvanize. It's that galvanizing call. And so time as a spiral never leads you to the same place. And this is, I think that it is very illusory to think that you can just wipe out, the past, for example, or something that is called traditional in order to build communities of new urbanites. And this is not simply China, it's just that China accelerated in the way that it brings about urban supremacy, but it's all over the world. The rural has always been dealt with as if what is in the countryside is stagnant or backward, for example. But as you could see in the film, if people in the countryside are so backward and so stagnant, why is it that they are so scared? As the lawyer said, they are terribly scared of the peasantry organizing themselves. And so this question keeps on coming up because in fact, as I see it, it's not a question of development. The supremacy, the urban supremacy, does not simply have to do with development, because you don't need to wipe out the past in order to have the present. You don't need to do away with old people in order to have only the young generation, for example. It is as absurd as that. So, of course, it is an illusion to think that you can just wipe out, all these villages and develop, for example, bring development to what is backward. It's more a question of control, because if you urbanize it, if you digitize all the farming situation, then you can control. So it is much more a question of control than a question of development, as understood linearly in the notion of progress.
And it's kind of anecdotal, but you were saying that since the time you spent filming here, that there's been a kind of acceleration in these communities and a Disneyfication actually of these, especially these amazing kind of Hakka villages. Could you say more about that? Because that's kind of an extraordinary twist in a way. This latest acceleration of that process.
Yes, if you remember the very first images of architecture that you saw is of this round house, right? The Hakka architecture, and if you go online and you search Hakka architecture, you'll be led to a page probably put on by travel agency for tourism purpose, and you would be led into these houses. So you would see these round houses, but in really nice shape, just like a Disney product, right? Very nice shape, or like a museum, the kind of museum that you create, folk museum, where people act as if they were working, but actually they were just doing certain things, for tourists to see. And so you would see this kind of houses. And when I asked the question, what is it that has disappeared? Obviously, with all these reconstructed Hakka dwellings, the material aspect didn't disappear. You can always reconstruct the material. But what is it that has disappeared? And the film give a number, of quote and unquote answers in relation to that question. Because, as things are all related, for example, what disappears is obviously not the material side, but everything that comes with that material side. And so you have a film like Mulan, a product of Disney, and in Mulan, Hakka dwellings were being used. And the first thing you notice is that these Hakka dwellings really look like Disney products, and almost like a cartoon type of Hakka houses. But what many Chinese scholars criticize is precisely that during the time of Mulan, there was no Hakka houses. So this is like imagination of what could appear, at that period. So this is some of the question that I leave it open, because you can continue to answer what is it that has disappeared. Yeah.
I thought I should open it out. I want to ask you one other very simple question, which is that what has the response been in China so far? It hasn't been shown yet, is that right? That in China?
No. Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing is to say that one of the funder is actually, as you could see, from Shanghai. And it was that funder who gave very generously, with the hope to show the film, of course, in the museum. But as soon as I finished the film, he told me it would not be possible to show the film on a regular basis, for many reasons. At first, it was mainly the preoccupation with the title, the question mark that comes with the title. So, what about China with the question mark, right? And it could be taken negatively because of the question mark. But the way that people have been translating it, like in French, you can translate it by retrouver la Chine, which is not to find again or to go back to tradition, but rather retrouver as to find a new China. And people also have been translating into Spanish, China, ¿qué tal? So China, how do you do? It's a question mark, but it's totally positive, right? So I think the title invites both. It's not merely negative, it's not merely positive, but it invites possibilities. So for that reason, it was already the curator said that it might not be able to show. But then the question of the peasantry in the film, even though I did it all very indirectly, and also I did it with a focus on music and on aesthetics and so on one of the concepts actually that was really put forward by the government themselves, the question of harmony. But of course, Chinese citizens, or netizens rather, are no fools. So whenever a word has become sensitive and it becomes censored on the internet, the netizens immediately say, the Chinese netizens immediately say, oh, this word has been harmonized. So this is how harmony also circulate. So a number of sensitive questions might come in, and especially the question of the peasantry. So the only way that that film could be shown is to be shown as special event, outside of a program that becomes regular, but something that is shown as special event. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. I'd really like to open it out, and I think we have a roving mic. So if you have comments or questions, or yes, we have one here.
Thank you very much for the film. It was quite surreal and also a very senseful experience. I wanted to know a little bit more about the selectivity in translating some parts and sometimes the absence of subtitle. Was that a stylistic approach that you deliberately took? And how does that generally speak on your discipline on translation?
Yes, actually, as it was said in the introduction before, I made a film called Surname Viet Give Name Nam, in which I dealt directly with the politics of interviews. So, in other words, people may use interviews and yet feel that talking heads are boring. And so they insert, for example, all kind of footage in order to interrupt those talking heads that are boring. Instead of doing that, I actually leave the talking heads in for quite a long time, sometimes 7 minutes, which in film, of course, is very long. And I leave it in so that you could see, so as to give hints to the viewer that the nature of these interviews, right? They have been translated. They have undergone several stages of translation. So they were carried out in Vietnamese, translated into French, and then translated into English by myself. So I did that deliberately in order to call attention on the politics of subtitling, of translation, and of interviewing. So that's the film that I dealt directly with it. But when you want to speak nearby, which means that you do not speak directly, because that's the way of either of speaking with, which is fine, or speaking about, you point your finger at it as if that is the object that you can capture. So that form of speaking about, I try to avoid. And that's why I, instead of either interviewing people or, as you said, translating what people say, right? But you go out in the street. This is the politics of everyday life, right? You go out in the street. You may think that every day is habitual, that you go out, you see the same thing every day. But actually, it's never the same. As soon as something happens, you have no control of it, So that's why during this time that is called that the terrorists are being focused on, the notion of the terrorists, you have so many instances of people doing their normal thing, everyday life, and then suddenly being jumped on as a suspect, becoming a suspect, in someone else's eyes. And a lot of, like Hui Zhu himself, who's from Beijing, when he was traveling to the US, he was stopped for hours and hours and hours at the airport because he's a suspect, becoming suspect. Suddenly, he didn't do anything, but his look make him suspect, for example. So the everyday is not habitual. So as soon as something happens, it takes on a charge that tells you that you cannot control it. So this is more interesting for me. And if you go out in the street and you translate everything that people say, then you lose your film. You don't have a film. So instead of doing that, I am choosing, as I said before, the voice of someone who had spent all her childhood among the peasantry, whose family is from the peasantry, and who is now, of course, displaced and not living within China anymore, but she goes back and forth. And so her reality is at the same time extremely interesting for me because I am positioned in a similar way. China is like an ancestral culture, but I'm also an outsider. Even if I'm familiar with a lot of it, I'm still an outsider. So outsider, insider, that kind of positioning. That's why you have to leave certain things not translated. And I have chosen to translate only when the singers tell us directly about the songs. So you put emphasis on the songs, but you don't put emphasis on the meaning of the songs, unless, one of them tell us something about it, which is not translating the meaning of each sentence, but just tell us about this song, which you do all the time when someone sings in a different language, right? So you don't have to translate every line, but you can give a context to that song. And this is what I translate in a film. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there more questions or comments? We have one down the front.
That's loud. I had a question about the architecture and how you chose to film it, and also I assume it's the architect from Beijing whose voice we hear, the male voice we hear.
Oh,
is that?
No, it's not. Okay. It's not his voice, but you are right, because in a way that voice represents him.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, because there seems to be quite some contrast between the way the architecture is filmed and that voice that takes a different perspective. I was feeling, at least watching the film, I don't know if that's...
you feel what?
That voice is speaking from a different perspective than the cinematography that moves through those spaces alongside the people that are in them. So I was... I guess it's a very open-ended question, but how you chose to film those buildings, I guess, is and the relationship to that voice.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes, first of all, I have when I showed this film, and a number of feminists did tell me, "You never had a male voice in your film before. How come you have one now?" So. And I think, and also that voice is very close to speaking about, even though I would say that, speaking about, when you want to avoid to speak about, you do not point directly. It's not like, this is what these people are doing, this is what they represent, this means this, for example, in relation to the image. You still speak nearby, but the information that he gives actually represent the voice of the informative voice You have Xiao Lugo, who is, you can say that it's like a biographical novelistic voice. You have the poetic voice, you have the informative voice, and you have my voice, which is in general reflective, even though I come in at some time in the information as well, because information are not neutral. You choose it, and I chose this information in relation to the architecture. So I come in from time to time to speak with that voice. But aside from that, the first thing that you probably notice is that for people who have sensitive ear, you immediately notice that the three women's voices are different voices. But if you are not used to it, you may hear it, you may not make the difference and hear it as a woman's voice, and that's it, right? So instead of three voices, you hear a woman's voice. And what you also hear is that the three voices, these three voices are all speaking with the first person, personal pronoun, the I. So who is I? When you hear this different context, right? There is one context where, the novelistic voice that speaks about Xitang and the fisherman and a background that has to do with Hui Muslim. And then you have this other voice that also speaks with I, but rather someone who is speaking about the father being a communist and the mother being the one who worked on airplane parts, for example. So there are differences, and of course my voice, which comes in as the outsider. So you have three I's. It's not as if you have I and them and us and them, or he and she, but here you have three I's. So that is the space of multivocality that is also being created with the three women's voice. The man's voice stands out precisely because I think that once you have made a number of films in which you refuse that space, that position, you can come back to it. You don't have to censor yourself. And you can give certain information, even though I was very careful in working with that voice, not to point directly as if you are speaking about, but giving information like nearby, sliding with it, with what you see, for example. So that voice also signals something that is very important for me, because people talk about feminist aesthetics and post-colonial and feminist aesthetics, but how do you define that aesthetics? Most of the time it's very difficult. You have to do the definition, you have to define it. Every time you make a film, you'll define it differently. So it comes very much with the material. However, there is a position that you can take, which is very much like the speaking nearby, which is to make a film with the feminist viewer in mind. And the feminist viewer here can be of any gender. So it's not merely a film about women, on women, taking women as a subject or object, but rather woman as the project. And as a project, sometimes she's obviously the subject of the film, and other times she's not obviously the subject, but she's the force of the film, because the film is addressing a feminist viewer. So this is how I see also the role of that voice.
Thanks. There's some more. There's one towards right up the back on the left-hand side.
Yeah. So first, just thanks for showing your film to all of us today. And you might have to bear with me for a second because I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to ask either. But I guess I'm just wondering about your thoughts about nature and the environment in the film, because at some points you kind of point to the idea of people in China seeing themselves as kind of part of the natural environment and taking that into account when they're building homes and structures. And I kind of thought of that a bit in tandem with when you were talking about ideas of kind of harmony and rhythm. And when you're talking about the wind being music. And I guess to me it was kind of apparent how the rhythms and harmonies in the urban areas versus the rural areas were quite different in some ways. And I was wondering if you see any relationship there between the physical surrounding environment and the living environments in rural areas versus cities.
Mm-hmm. There is each city has its own soundscape. And of course, the countryside also has its own soundscape. So I would say the soundscape are very specific to the location. And with that in mind, you can approach, for example, just like we approach a culture, not simply by interviewing people, but looking at the architecture that people have built for themselves. The same way, what kind of soundscape is being created with a community or with a neighborhood, and how that soundscape may change, for example, in the city when the community has changed. It's like this story with the grandmother, when the officials came in to ask her about how many people live where she lives. For them, it's a very obvious question, a very simple question, but she was kind of astonished, and she said, "You should ask when." And of course they said, "We are asking you a simple question." Maybe they would help her and said 2, 3, and she's even more offended because she said, "Well, I've lived here for 50 years and the number of people have always changed. This is a very different sense of time. It's the time that include the disappeared, the departed, the present, the absent, the visible and the invisible." And I thought it was a wonderful instance, example of how time differ, how people, this is part of, quote and unquote, what has disappeared or what is disappearing, with the move to urban supremacy. And so with the music, you remember also in relation to nature, there is an instance where I was talking about the human body being like a geometer, that you measure everything according to the human body, and that acupuncture, which acts on the human body, is actually also the way that the geomancy acts on landscape. The human body and the land is similar. The human body in its cosmic dimension is just like the land that you have around. So the beating of the land or the rhythm of the land is also the rhythm of the human body. And this is what has been used for centuries in the past, in architecture, in music, and in any of the arts, as you could see, the painting as well. And this is what could be, something that is disappearing, something that is invisible to the eye. The visible part you can always retrieve, but this other part is a big question mark. Right?
I think maybe we have time for one more question, if there's or a comment, if there's one out there in the dark. Or if not, maybe I can actually just ask you one last thing, which is just about Celia mentioned at the beginning that you have 5 film projects that you're juggling at the moment, and I think Celia was encouraging you to start a 6th one about Oslo. So, could you just say what else? What are the other projects that are pressing themselves to the front of the queue at the moment? What else are you most preoccupied with right now?
Thank you so much. But on the one hand, I can always say something about this project. But as you know, the projects take shape when you work on it. Doesn't exist before. So in other words, I have shot in a number of places, start out with a project, but as I said also, they are there and they are waiting for funding and they're waiting also to mature. One of the projects is concern Yemen, so it is also a place that I didn't know about before, so it was very much entering into the unknown, with that project. And then I have also something. So far, people always ask, but you're not offering us anything. Why don't you make a film on the U.S., or on San Francisco? And of course, the commitment that I have is first to focus on this solidarity that we call South-South, where you focus on what is considered to be the third world, but this is, again, just like the peasantry, right? The third world is only defined third in relation to economical power. So I actually had lots of footage that I have shot in the desert of the US. And maybe that's a good place to begin with the US, the desert. Because it's a notion that exists in the city as well as physically in the desert. And how we leave the desert within ourselves is also very, very telling and very important. So that's 2 projects, and then I have shot a lot in Indonesia, and I have also a project on the other France, so focusing on France, but even though, all the aspect of France that many of us love in the culture may be there, but it's also a way of looking at the other France. What is French exactly?
Fantastic. Well, we very much hope you'll be back in Oslo to show one of these projects in the near future. I think maybe we should wrap up, but just to say a huge thank you for sharing the film and for coming to speak as well.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's thanks to you that we have all these conversations, so thank you very much. Yeah.